Welcome back to Sleeping in Ancient Times. Tonight's journey is quieter, darker, and stranger than before. A calm walk through the past, where one ordinary life hides a terrible secret. The candle has burned to nothing. You notice this before anything else. The small tallow stub that Agnes keeps pressed into the iron holder above the hearth, the one she lights only when she cannot sleep, only when the dark presses too close, has melted entirely away. The wax has run down the wall in pale ribbons and dried there, stiff as a scar. The wick is a black thread curled against the stone. It is not yet dawn. The village is silent in the way villages are silent, when the cold is very deep and no one dares open a shutter. You are standing in the doorway of her house, and you do not go in. There is something on the table. You cannot make out its shape clearly from here. The fire has burned low, and the room beyond the doorframe is nearly all shadow, and what little light remains comes not from inside, but from the blue-gray sky above the lane, which has begun very faintly to suggest morning. You look at the shape on the table. It is too small to be a person, too deliberate to be an accident. It has been arranged, that much is clear even from the doorway, placed with intention, with care, in the precise center of the surface where the family eats their meals and folds their linen and kneads their dough. You do not know what it means, but somewhere behind the house, past the garden and the small pen where the goats are kept, past the low stone wall that marks the edge of the field, somewhere out there in the cold and the half-dark, something is moving, not quickly, not with urgency, slowly, steadily, the way a person moves when they believe no one is watching. And then the movement stops. There is only the silence, and the shape on the table, and the smell of something that has been burning for a very long time. But before the night reached this point, the day began quietly. It is still dark when the village stirs. The sky above the valley holds the particular blue-black of an hour that belongs neither to night nor morning, a color that has no name in the language of farmers, only a feeling, cold, suspended, full of the ordinary weight of what must be done before the light arrives. You are standing at the edge of a world that is very old and very small and very certain of itself. The village sits in a shallow bend of land in northern France, cradled between a slow river to the west and a ragged line of oak forest to the east. It is the year 1250, though no one here marks time that way. They mark it instead by feast days and harvest days, by the depth of the mud in the lanes after rain, by how many winters a family has survived in a particular house, by the memory of a frost that killed the rye 4 years past and left 3 children hungry through to spring. There are perhaps 40 households in this village, perhaps fewer if you do not count the shepherd's family who live half a day's walk up the hill and come down only for feast days and funerals. The houses are low and close together, built from timber frames packed with wattle and daub, their roofs thick with straw that has darkened over years of smoke and rain. The lanes between them are narrow and uneven, worn into the earth by generations of feet and hooves and cartwheel. In the wet season they fill with mud that swallows a boot to the ankle. This morning they are dry and cold and dusted with the first light frost of the year, each blade of grass along the verge standing separate and silver. The first sounds you hear are animal sounds, a pig shifting in its pen, a rooster calling from somewhere behind the forge, the low, throaty complaint of cattle being led toward the common pasture, their breath rising in white clouds that drift apart in the still air. These sounds arrive before the light does, and they are, in their own way, a kind of comfort. They are the sounds of a village that knows what it is and what it must do, a village that has not changed in any essential way for longer than any living person can remember. The church bell rings once, not the full peal, only one slow stroke, heavy and deliberate, the way a bell rings when it is reminding rather than announcing. The sound travels out across the rooftops and is absorbed by the fog that has settled along the river, and then the village is quiet again. You begin to move through the lanes. The smell of the village is layered and particular. Smoke first, always smoke, rising from the chimney holes above each house as the morning fires catch. Beneath the smoke there is damp earth, and beneath the earth the sweetness of hay and the sharper smell of animals, and beneath all of it, faintly, the cold mineral scent of the river. There is also something else this morning, something you cannot immediately identify, a sweetness that is not quite the sweetness of hay. It is heavier than that, darker. It comes and goes on the air as you walk, present for a moment and then gone, like a sound at the edge of hearing. You tell yourself it is nothing. The lanes are beginning to fill with the first movement of the day. A woman carrying a clay pot toward the well, her breath clouding around her, her wooden shoes clacking against the frost-hard earth. An old man standing in his doorway with his hands pressed flat to either side of the frame, watching the sky with an expression that is neither alarm nor contentment, but something in between. The look of a man reading weather. Two children running with a dog between the houses, cutting through gaps so narrow they must turn sideways, laughing at something that is already behind them. Ordinary, all of it, entirely ordinary. The houses here are built close to the ground, as though the village is trying to keep itself small against the sky. The windows are narrow slits covered with oiled cloth that lets in light without letting in wind, and in the mornings the cloth glows faintly amber from the fires within, like the houses themselves are breathing. The doors are low, hung on leather hinges, and most of them stand open in the early hour despite the cold, because in a village this size, a closed door in the morning is a thing that invites attention, and attention invites questions, and questions are rarely welcome. At the center of the village is the square, if it can be called that. It is more of a widening of the lanes, a place where three paths meet around a stone trough that serves as the primary watering point for animals and, when the well is running low in August, for people as well. The trough is green with moss along its inner walls. There is a wooden cross planted in the earth beside it, old enough that the wood has turned gray, and the carved figure upon it has been almost entirely smoothed away by years of hands touching it as they passed. People touch it still, without thinking, without pausing. They touch it the way they breathe. Near the square, separated from the other houses by a small garden, enclosed in a low wicker fence, stands the house of Agnes. It is not a remarkable house. It is slightly larger than some of the others, with a second room at the back where the family stores grain and dried herbs and the tools they cannot afford to leave out in the weather. The garden is well kept, even now in the deep cold, the beds turned and mulched and laid under thick covers of straw in neat rows that speak of someone who pays careful attention to the work. There is a small goat pen at the side, a modest wood pile beneath an overhang, a stone step worn smooth at the threshold. It is a house that looks, from the outside, like a house that has nothing to hide. The wicker gate to the garden stands slightly open. This is unusual. Agnes is known in the village for keeping her gate closed, for keeping her garden in order. for keeping, in general, a kind of quiet discipline over the small boundaries of her domestic life. It is one of the things people say about her, not unkindly, when they speak of her at all, that she is careful, that she is particular, that things around her are always exactly as they should be. The gate moves slightly in the morning air, swinging a small distance open and then back, open and then back, as though someone has only just passed through it. You stand in the lane and look at the gate for a moment. From inside the house, there is no sound, no fire smell rising from the chimney, no movement behind the oiled cloth of the window, nothing that suggests a household rousing itself for the day in the ordinary way of households. You look up at the chimney hole. No smoke. The cold settles around you more completely now, and you become aware of a sound you had not noticed before. A sound that is not quite a sound, more a quality of the morning air around this particular house, a faint and rhythmic something that might be breathing, or might be wind, or might be nothing at all. You listen for a moment longer. Then the church bell rings again, twice this time, and along the lane a door opens and a man calls out to his son, and the village reassembles itself around you in all its ordinary noise and motion, and you let it carry you forward. The day has begun, and Agnes, wherever she is, has already been awake for a very long time. It does not arrive the way it does in open country, where the horizon catches the first edge of the sun and the whole sky changes at once. Here, between the houses, the light has to work its way down through the gap between rooftops, sliding along the upper timbers of the buildings first, touching the high edges of the thatch before it reaches the lanes below. By the time it touches the ground, it is already filtered, already softened, and the village exists for a long stretch of morning in a kind of amber half-dark that is neither night nor full day but something in between. You walk further into it. The lane that runs along the western edge of the village is the widest of the three main paths, wide enough for a cart to pass with a little room on either side, and this is where most of the morning movement gathers. Women carry wooden buckets toward the well. A boy drives 3 goats ahead of him with a long stick, calling to them in a low, repeated sound that is not quite a word. A man in a gray wool tunic stands outside his door and uses a short knife to cut a piece of bread, eating it standing, looking at nothing in particular. Everything moves with the ease of long habit. The buildings along this lane are older than the ones near the square, their timber frames darker with age, some of them leaning slightly toward one another as though they have grown accustomed to each other's weight over the decades. The daub between the beams has cracked in places and been repaired with a paler mixture that stands out against the older surface in patches, like healed skin. The roofs are low enough that a tall man must duck when passing beneath the overhanging eaves, and from those eaves hang the remnants of the summer, dried bundles of herbs, a string of onions gone papery and light, a pair of boots that someone has given up on and hung by their laces to sway in the cold air. The smell this morning is wood smoke and frost, and something animal beneath both. At the end of the western lane, where the path bends toward the river, there is a small covered market space. Not a true market, not the kind that draws traders from other villages on feast days, but a permanent fixture of daily exchange. A low timber roof set on 6 posts above a stretch of beaten earth where the women of the village bring what they have and take what they need. There are only 4 stalls this early in the morning, a woman selling hard rounds of cheese wrapped in cloth, a man with a basket of dried fish, their bodies stiff and dark, their eyes white, an elderly woman crouching beside a wooden board on which she has arranged small clay pots of rendered fat and dried herbs tied with strips of rag, and at the 4th stall, the bread. The baker's wife has been here since before the light came, as she always is. Her name is Marguerite, and she is a large, capable woman with flower in her eyebrows and a way of speaking that makes everything she says sound like an instruction. She sets out the loaves in 2 rows, the dark rye ones on the left, the smaller wheat loaves on the right, and between them the flatbreads that are sold cheapest and bought most. The smell of the bread reaches you before you reach the stall, warm and yeasty and deeply ordinary, and for a moment it overrides everything else. You stop at the stall and look at the loaves. Marguerite watches you with the patient expression of a woman who has been selling bread her entire life and has learned that people need a moment before they know what they want. She says nothing. Behind her, a young girl, her daughter, perhaps 10 years old, sits on an upturned bucket and winds a length of twine around her fingers in a pattern that is almost a game. Almost. You ask Marguerite, without quite meaning to, whether she has seen Ayes this morning. The question lands in a small silence. It is not a long silence, not long enough to mean anything definite. But Marguerite's eyes move, just slightly, and the girl on the bucket stops winding the twine, and the woman selling cheese at the next stall turns her head away with a degree of deliberateness that is itself a kind of answer. Marguerite says that she has not. She says it evenly, the way a person says something they have been saying for a while and have gotten comfortable with. Then she picks up one of the dark rye loaves and holds it toward you, and the moment closes, and the market resumes its sounds around you. You take the bread and move on. The river is visible now through the gap between 2 houses at the end of the lane. A flat gray line in the early light, still and heavy, barely moving. In summer it runs quick and brown and full of noise. In winter, it slows to something barely distinguishable from the frozen mud along its banks, and the children are forbidden to play near it because the edge can give way without warning. A man drowned there 7 winters past. No one mentions it by name, but everyone remembers. You can tell they remember by the way they look at it, or rather by the way they do not look at it. A collective not looking that has become, over the years, as habitual as prayer. You follow the lane as it curves away from the river and brings you back toward the center of the village. The forge is open. You can hear it before you see it. The rhythmic clang of iron, steady and unhurried. The sound of a man working through something long and patient. The forge itself is a low, open-fronted building, set slightly apart from the others because of the risk of fire, and as you pass it, you feel the heat roll out toward you from the open face like a wall, a sudden warm pressure against the cold of the lane. The blacksmith does not look up. He is a quiet man in his 40s, with arms that have thickened over decades of this same work, and he stands at his anvil in the orange light of the coals and strikes, and does not look up. On the ground outside the forge, half hidden beneath the wooden workbench that runs along the outside wall, there is a bundle of rags. You almost walk past it. Something makes you slow. You look at the bundle more carefully, and after a moment you understand that the rags have a shape, a specific, deliberate shape. Not the shape of something discarded, the shape of something placed. They are folded, or rather gathered, in a way that suggests a person's hands were involved. And from the center of the bundle, barely visible beneath the outermost layer of cloth, there is a stem, a dried plant stem, thin and pale, with a small cluster of seed heads still clinging to it. You know this plant. Everyone in the village knows it. It grows along the edge of the forest, in the damp shadows where the light does not quite reach, and the older women speak of it with a particular tone of voice that is not quite fear and not quite respect, but somewhere between the two. It is not used in cooking. It is not used for any ordinary purpose that you have been told about directly. You stand looking at the bundle for a moment. Then the blacksmith's hammer strikes the anvil, loud and sudden, and you step back from the bench and continue along the lane. The well square is busier now. The morning has gained its footing, and the village has reached the part of the day where everyone is in motion at once. The particular organized chaos of a community attending to itself. Children are being sent on errands. A man argues quietly but firmly with his neighbor about the placement of a fence post. Two women stand at the side of the trough and speak to each other in voices too low to hear clearly, and when one of them catches your eye across the square, she does not smile, only looks, and then looks away. You have lived among people long enough to know what that look means. It means they were talking about someone. Near the well, drawn into the partial shadow of the church wall as though she would prefer not to be seen, stands a woman you recognize as one of the older residents of the village, a widow named Clothilde, who has lived here since before most of the current inhabitants were born. She is small and bent, and dressed in a dark wool wrap that she holds closed at her throat with one hand. She is looking at nothing in particular, or she is looking at everything. It is sometimes difficult to tell the difference with Clothilde. You nod to her as you pass. She does not nod back. She says something, very quietly, in a voice pitched for you alone. You stop. You ask her to say it again. She looks at you for a long moment with eyes that are very pale and very steady. Then she shakes her head once, slowly, and pulls the dark wool tighter around her throat and turns her gaze back toward the lane. You stand there for a moment after she looks away. The words she spoke were too quiet to be certain of, half lost in the sounds of the square around you. But you caught enough. 2 words, 3 at most. Something about Agni, something about the field. The church bell rings the full morning peal now. 6 slow strokes that roll out across the rooftops and scatter a pair of jackdaws from the bell tower in a burst of black wings. The sound fills the square completely and then fades, and in the silence that follows, the ordinary noise of the village reassembles itself around you, and everything looks exactly as it should. Or you look down the lane toward Agnes's house. The gate is still open, and the chimney is still cold. You find her in the garden. She is kneeling at the far end of the second bed, the one closest to the wicker fence, working the soil with a short-handled iron hoe in slow, methodical strokes. She does not look up when the gate swings open behind you. She does not acknowledge the sound of your footsteps on the frozen earth. She simply continues, stroke after stroke, even, unhurried, as though she has been at this for a very long time and intends to continue for a very long time more. The light is still thin. Your breath clouds in the cold air. You stand for a moment and watch her. Agnes is a woman of perhaps 35 years, though the outdoor life has put more weather in her face than her age alone accounts for. She is not a large woman, but she is a strong one. You can see it in the way she holds the hoe, in the economy of her movements, in the way her back stays straight through the effort without any appearance of strain. Her dark hair is covered by a linen coif tied beneath her chin. Her dress is a deep undyed wool, heavy and practical, tucked up slightly at the hem to keep it clear of the soil. Her hands, when the light catches them, are the hands of someone who has worked this ground for years. Broad at the palm, short-nailed, the knuckles prominent. She is wearing no gloves. This is the detail that stops you. The frost has not fully lifted from the garden beds, and the air is cold enough that your own hands, inside their wool wraps, have grown stiff at the fingers. But Agnes works the soil bare-handed, and from where you stand you can see that her fingers are very pale. Not the pale of ordinary cold, something deeper. Something that suggests she has been out here since long before the morning came. You call her name. She looks up then, and her face, when it turns toward you, is composed and calm and entirely ordinary. She smiles. It is a real smile, or something close enough to one that you cannot find fault with it. She rises from her knees without difficulty, brushes the soil from her dress with practiced strokes, and walks toward you through the narrow path between the beds. She asks what brings you to her gate. You tell her nothing in particular. You were passing. You saw the gate open. She nods at this as though it is a perfectly satisfying answer. Up close, you can see that her eyes are clear but underlined with shadow. The particular shadow of a night spent without sleep, or spent sleeping badly, in the broken intervals of someone whose mind will not hold still. There is a small cut on the back of her left hand, fresh enough that it has not yet fully closed. A thin dark line across the knuckle of the first finger. She has not bandaged it. She does not appear to have noticed it. You do not mention the cut. The garden is, as it always is, exceptionally ordered. The beds are laid out in 3 long rows, separated by narrow paths of bare earth just wide enough to kneel beside. The first bed holds the remnants of the autumn kitchen garden, the last of the leeks, still standing in their row, pale green and patient. A few remaining turnips, their leafy tops gone but the root shoulders still showing above the soil. A border of dried thyme along the edge, cut back to stubs, the smell of it still faint in the cold air when the wind passes over it. The second bed, the one where Agnes was working, is different. It has been turned recently. All of it, the whole length. The soil broken up and moved and resettled in a way that suggests not planting but something else, not cultivation, not preparation for seed. The earth here has the look of ground that has been disturbed and then smoothed over, deliberately, carefully, as though the disturbance itself was the point. You ask her what she is planting there. She says winter rye. She says it without hesitation, without looking at the bed. She says it the way a person says something they decided they would say before anyone asked. You look at the bed. The soil is too loose, too recently moved for winter rye. The season for winter rye is past. Anyone who has kept a garden knows this. You say nothing. She leads you inside. The house of Agnes is a single main room with a low ceiling crossed by 2 heavy beams, and it smells of dried herbs and cold ash and something else beneath those. Something faintly sweet that you cannot place, sweet in the way that things are sweet when they have been left too long in an enclosed space. The fire has been rebuilt since the early morning, but it is still small, still finding itself, and the room is colder than it ought to be at this hour. The table at the center of the room is bare. You remember, from the doorway in the cold dark of before dawn, the shape that was arranged in the middle of this table. You look at the surface now, and it is clean and empty, the wood scrubbed, the grain of it pale where it is dry. Whatever was there is gone, not simply moved. Gone. The table has been cleaned around it. Deliberately, the way you clean around something you do not want to be asked about. The hearth tools hang in their usual places. The straw pallets are rolled and set against the wall. A loaf of bread, partially eaten, sits on the shelf above the hearth beside a clay cup and a small iron pot. Everything is in order. everything except the smell. It comes from the back room, the room where she keeps the grain and the tools and the dried herbs. The door to the back room is closed, and there is a piece of cloth pushed into the gap at the bottom of it. Not enough cloth to seal the gap entirely, but enough to suggest that someone has tried. Anya moves to the hearth and begins to tend the fire, her back to the door. She talks as she works. She talks about the cold, about the state of the lane after last week's rain, about her neighbor's cow, which has been making a sound at night that nobody can account for. She talks the way a person talks when they are filling space with sound, when they are using words to crowd out whatever might be said if the words stop. You listen. You watch her hands on the fire tools. Her right hand is steady. Her left, the one with the cut, presses flat against her thigh when she is not using it, as though she is holding something in place or holding something down. You ask if her husband is about. There is a pause, short but present. She says he has gone to the mill. She says he left before first light. She says it looking at the fire, and the fire has caught now and is beginning to put a warm light into the room, and in that light her face is very still, very settled, the way a face is still when it has decided not to give anything away. Her husband's boots are beside the door. You see them as you glance toward the entrance. They are his only pair. You know this, the way you know most things about most people in a village this small. The heavy ones he wears for the wet and the cold, resoled twice, patched at the ankle with a strip of darker leather. A man does not walk to the mill before first light and leave his boots behind. You look at the boots for a moment. Agnes adds a piece of wood to the fire, and the flame rises and the room grows warmer, and she turns to you with an expression of such complete normality that for a moment you almost set the boots aside. Almost aside that you misremember that he has another pair, that there is an explanation you have simply not thought of. Almost. She offers you a cup of water and you take it, because refusing would require an explanation of its own. The water is cold and clean and tastes faintly of the clay pot it was kept in. You hold the cup and stand in the warm room and listen to the fire and the sounds of the village outside the low window, the ordinary sounds of the morning continuing without concern. Agnes sits on the low stool near the hearth and folds her hands in her lap. And the left hand is on top. The cut faces upward. She does not look at it. She looks at the fire steadily, with an expression that is not quite peace and not quite grief, but somewhere in the narrow country between them. You finish the water. You tell her you should continue on your way. She nods without looking up. You cross to the door, and as you lift the latch, you pause, not for any reason you could immediately name, only a feeling, the particular pull of something unfinished, and you look back at her. She is still looking at the fire. Her lips are moving very slightly, very quietly, the way lips move when a person is counting, or when they are reciting something they have said so many times it no longer requires full breath to say it. You go out into the lane and pull the door closed behind you. The cold meets you immediately, sharp and clean after the interior of the house. You stand for a moment in the lane and look at the closed door, and then at the garden gate, and then at the second bed with its freshly turned and smoothed and deliberate earth. The smell from the back room follows you, faintly through the door. Sweet, still, patient, like something waiting to be found. The village reaches its fullest noise around midday. This is when the lanes are most crowded, when the morning's tasks have moved into their middle phase and people are crossing between obligations, carrying things, fetching things, delivering things, and the square fills and empties and fills again in a rhythm that is almost tidal. The sun has climbed enough to clear the rooftops, and the frost has long since lifted, and the air smells now of cook fires and turned earth, and the particular warm animal smell of a dozen households going about their business at once. You move through it slowly. There is a cart pulled up at the edge of the square, loaded with winter vegetables from one of the outlying farms. Sacks of dried beans, ropes of onion, a crate of small hard apples gone slightly wrinkled at the skin but still good for keeping. The farmer who has brought them is a lean man with a sun-dark face who stands beside his cart and calls out prices in a voice worn flat by repetition. People gather around him. Someone argues about the quality of the beans. A child tries to take an apple and has its hand slapped before it even closes. Ordinary commerce, ordinary dispute. You stop and watch from the far side of the square. Agnes is there. She stands a little apart from the crowd around the cart, which is itself slightly unusual. In a village where the arrival of farm goods is one of the few commercial events of the day, most people press in close. Agnes stands back. She is looking at the apples, or she appears to be looking at the apples, but there is something in the angle of her gaze that suggests she is not really looking at anything in front of her. She is present the way a person is present when some large part of them is somewhere else entirely. She has a basket on her arm. It is covered with a piece of folded cloth. You watch her move to the cart and exchange a few words with the farmer. Money changes hands. The small clipped silver coins that serve here for all but the smallest transactions. She takes something from the cart without looking at it and places it in the basket beneath the cloth and draws the cloth back over and turns from the cart before the farmer has finished speaking to her. He watches her go. His expression is difficult to read from across the square. You follow her at a distance. She moves through the midday crowd with the ease of someone who knows every lane and every turning, and she does not stop to speak to anyone, which is notable. In a village this size, the midday hour is a social one. People pause, people ask after each other's children and comment on the weather, and pass along information about whose fence has fallen and whose cow has gone lame. It is the hour when the village stitches itself together through small conversation. To move through it in silence, without stopping, is its own kind of statement. No one calls out to Agnes. This is what you notice next. Not that she refuses to speak, but that no one attempts to speak to her. People see her coming and find reasons to be looking elsewhere. A woman who is standing directly in Agnes's path steps to the side before Agnes reaches her, a movement so smooth and practiced it barely registers as movement at all. Two men talking in the lane mouth of a side passage fall quiet as she passes and resume their conversation only when she is gone. The village is giving her room, not with hostility, not with fear exactly, with something quieter and more considered than either. The way a community accommodates something it has decided, collectively, not to address directly. She turns down the lane that leads away from the square toward the lower part of the village, where the older houses sit and the lane narrows to barely more than a footpath before it ends at a low wooden bridge over a drainage ditch. You follow. She goes to the house of the old widow, Clothilde. The door is already open when she arrives, which means Clothilde was expecting her. Agnes does not knock. She steps through the doorway without pausing, pulling the cloth back from her basket as she crosses the threshold and the door closes behind her. You stand in the lane outside. The house is quiet. From within there is the low murmur of voices but no individual words, the sound of something being set on a table, a longer silence. Then Clothilde's voice, briefly louder, with a tone in it you cannot quite name. Not anger, not fear, but the tone a person uses when they are saying something they have said before and not been listened to. And then nothing. You wait for a long time. The lane is empty and cold, and the drainage ditch beyond the bridge carries a thin line of dark water that catches the midday light and gives it back in pieces. When Agnes comes out, she is not carrying the basket. She has left it inside. She comes through the door with empty hands and a face that has settled into something smooth and unreadable, and she walks back up the lane toward the square without looking left or right, and without looking at you, though she must see you standing there. You go to Clothilde's door. The old woman is sitting at her table in the dim interior, and the basket is open in front of her, and her hands are resting flat on the table on either side of it, as though she is not sure whether to reach inside or push it away. She looks up when you appear in the doorway. Her pale eyes move from your face to the lane behind you and back again. You ask what Agnes has brought her? Clothilde is quiet for a long moment. Then she reaches into the basket and lifts out a small clay pot, sealed at the top with a round of waxed cloth tied down with twine. The pot is unremarkable, the kind used for preserves, for rendered fat, for the small domestic preparations that pass between households without comment. But Clothilde holds it at a distance, between two fingers, as though it is hot, or as though she does not want it against her palm. She says that Agnes brings her this every season, has brought it every season for the past 3 years. She says this in a careful voice, the voice of a person selecting words with attention. You ask what is in the pot. Clothilde sets it down on the table and looks at it. She says it is a preparation. Something for the joints, she was told. Something for the cold that gets into the bones. She says Agnes makes it herself from what she gathers, and that it works, she supposes, better than anything the priest has ever offered her, and that she has been taking it each winter without complaint. She pauses, but this year, she says, she found one of her goats dead beside the pen, 3 days after she finished the last pot. The room is very quiet. You look at the sealed pot on the table. Clothilde says that a goat can die of many things. She says she is an old woman, and she knows better than to draw a line between 2 points and call it a road. She says she has known Agnes since Agnes was a child brought to this village by a husband twice her age, and that she has no reason to believe anything except that she is an old woman whose joints ache and whose goat is dead. She says all of this in a steady, even voice. Then she puts her hands in her lap and looks out the low window at the lane and says one more thing, very quietly. She says that in 3 years of taking the preparation, she has never once asked what is in it, and she has never asked, she says, because some part of her did not want to know. You leave Clothilde's house and step back into the midday lane. The sun is at its highest now, such as it is, pale and thin and offering light without warmth. And the village around you continues in its ordinary business, and somewhere on the other side of the square a dog is barking at something that does not appear to be there. You think about the second garden bed, the turned and smoothed earth, the wrong season for rye. You think about the smell from the back room. You think about the forest plant in the bundle outside the forge, its pale stem and clinging seeds, and the way the older women speak of it in a tone that lives between fear and respect. You think about the forest that edges this village to the east, its dark interior, the places where the light does not reach, the damp shadow ground where things grow that are not named in the ordinary language of kitchen gardens. Agnes gathers what she needs from the forest. She has been doing it for years, and she gives it, carefully measured, sealed under wax, to the people she chooses. You stand in the lane and let the midday noise move around you. Somewhere at the edge of your understanding, something is beginning to take shape. Not clearly, not yet, but the outline of it is there, if you are willing to look at it directly. You are not entirely sure you are. The light begins to leave the village slowly, the way it always does in this part of the year. It does not drop suddenly. It retreats. It pulls back from the ground first, gathering itself up into the upper air, turning the sky above the rooftops a deep and luminous orange that fades at its edges into gray, then into the particular blue that comes just before dark. The walls of the houses catch the last of it and hold it for a while, the pale daub turning briefly amber, and then that too fades, and the village is left in its own dimness. The color of old linen, the color of ash. The lanes empty quickly once the light begins to go. This is the habit of the village. When the sun moves, the people move with it, back through their doors, back to their hearths, to the meal and the fire and the small enclosed world of the household. The shutters come down one by one along the western lane. The market space is bare, the stalls collapsed and carried in, the beaten earth beneath them swept clean and left for morning. The forge has gone cold. The well square holds a few last figures hurrying through it with their heads down, and then it too is empty, and the only sound from the square is the wooden cross shifting slightly in the evening wind. You are not ready to go inside. You walk back through the emptying lanes with the cold settling around you, and something settling inside you as well. A weight, a heaviness, that is not quite fear but is no longer comfortable. You have been turning the day over in your mind since you left Clothilde's house, the bed of turned earth, the husband's boots, the sealed pot held at a distance between two fingers, the word Clothilde used at the very end when you were already at the door. She had not said preparation. She had said making. There is a difference, and you have been feeling the difference without being able to name it. And now in the evening cold, the name is beginning to come. A preparation is something assembled, something practical, something a person with knowledge of plants and roots and seasons might put together for a useful purpose, for aching joints and cold bones, and pass between households the way knowledge has always passed between the women of a village, quietly, practically, without ceremony. And making is something else. You pass the church. The door is closed, which is unusual for this hour. The priest here is a methodical man who keeps his church open until the evening prayer, and the evening prayer has not yet been called. You stop and look at the closed door for a moment. There is light visible beneath it, the thin line of candlelight. And from within comes a sound. Not prayer, not singing, but the low and urgent rhythm of a voice speaking very quickly in a register that carries the shape of distress without carrying the individual words. You stand at the church door and listen. The voice stops. Then the door opens, and the priest stands in the candlelight looking at you. He is a man of 60 or so, thin-shouldered, with a face that has carried the particular exhaustion of someone responsible for the souls of 40 households through several decades of ordinary difficulty. Tonight, that face holds something additional, something newer and less settled. He looks at you for a long moment. He says he is glad to see you. He says it in the voice of a man who means it precisely. He asks if you have been to the house of Agnes today. When you tell him you have, he closes his eyes briefly, the way a person closes their eyes when they receive information they were afraid of receiving. Then he opens them and steps back from the doorway and asks you to come in. The church is cold. The altar candles are lit, but the space is too large for them to warm. You stand near the door while the priest moves to the altar and back, his hands working against each other in front of him, working the way hands work when the mind is trying to find the beginning of something difficult. He tells you that a man came to him this morning. A man from the next village, 2 hours' walk to the north, who had heard something and come to ask the priest about it. Not a confession, not a formal matter, a question, the priest says, between one man and another, about a woman in this village who had been seen on 3 separate occasions at the edge of the eastern forest after dark. The priest pauses. He says the man from the north had a child go missing in the summer, a boy of 7, gone into the forest in the morning and not come back, and not found, not by any search, not by any means. He looks at you. He says he does not know what it means. He says he is a man of God and not a man of accusation, and that he will not say a name and he will not draw a line between 2 points and call it a road. You have heard these words before today. Clotilde said almost exactly the same thing. You leave the church and step back into the dark lane. The sky has gone fully gray now, the last of the orange pressed out of it, and the first stars are beginning to appear in the east above the forest line. The forest itself is a black mass at the edge of the visible world, its tree line ragged and dense, the space beneath its canopy entirely dark from this distance. You look at it for a moment. 3 separate occasions, after dark. You walk to Agnes's house. The gate is closed now. The chimney has begun at last to put out smoke, a thin thread of it rising straight in the still evening air, which means the fire has been properly built, which means she has been home for some time. The shutters are drawn. The oiled cloth in the window frame glows faintly from within. You stand at the gate. You tell yourself you have no reason to go further, no reason that would satisfy anyone who asked. You tell yourself it is late and the cold is deep and you have been walking all day, and there is a hearth waiting for you, and nothing in the world that requires you to stand in the dark outside the house of a woman who has given you every outward indication of leading an ordinary life. Then you hear it from inside the house, low and rhythmic, barely audible through the closed shutters and the closed door, a sound that is not quite singing and not quite speaking, a sound with a pattern to it, a repeated cadence, the same cluster of syllables returning again and again, the way a wheel returns to the same point. You have heard this sound before. This morning, in the warm room by the fire, her lips moving, very slightly, very quietly. Oh. You push open the gate. The garden path is dark, the beds on either side reduced to shadows, and as you move along it toward the door you pass the second bed, the disturbed one, the smoothed one, and you stop. There is something in the bed that was not there this morning, a small bunch of dried flowers, bound with dark thread, pressed into the soil at the head of the bed. The stems are very pale in the darkness, almost luminous. You crouch and look at them without touching. They are the kind that grow at the forest edge, in the shadow damp where the light fails, the same kind that appeared in the bundle outside the forge. They have been arranged with care, their heads face down, pressed into the earth, as though they are listening to what is below, or feeding it. Oh, you stand up slowly. From inside the house, the sound continues. The same syllables, the same return, and underneath the sound, so faint you cannot be certain it is real, something else. The sweet smell, the smell from the sealed back room, heavier now in the cold evening air, sweeter, not rot, not decay, something more deliberate than that, something that has been prepared. You stand in the dark garden between the beds and look at the closed door of the house, the thread of smoke rising from the chimney, the faint glow at the edges of the shuttered window. Behind you, very distantly, the church bell begins to ring the evening prayer. 6 strokes, slow and heavy. And from inside the house, on exactly the first stroke of the bell, the sound stops. Complete silence. Then a footstep inside the house, crossing toward the door. You do not move. The latch lifts. The door opens. Agnes stands in the threshold with a candle in her hand, and the light of it reaches up into her face from below and makes of her something briefly unfamiliar. The planes of her cheeks sharper, the hollows of her eyes deeper, the expression she carries unreadable, in the way that faces become unreadable when light comes at them from the wrong direction. She looks at you standing in her garden. She does not ask what you are doing there. She does not ask how long you have been standing in the dark between her beds. She simply holds the candle and looks at you with an expression that is almost recognition, almost relief, almost something you cannot name. And then she steps back from the threshold and leaves the door open behind her, an invitation or a resignation. You are not certain there is a difference. You go inside. The room is warmer now, the fire properly built at last, the flames high enough to fill the low space with unsteady orange light. The table is still bare. The shelf above the hearth holds its usual objects. Nothing has changed since the morning except the quality of the air, which is heavy with the smell now. The sweet, closed smell that has followed you at the edges of your perception all day. And here in the house it is unmistakable and complete. It is the smell of hemlock. You know it. Once you are standing inside it, the way you know a word that has been on the edge of your tongue all day. Hemlock has a smell like no other plant in the forest. Sweet and cold and green and wrong all at once. A sweetness that the body recognizes before the mind does, that produces in the chest a faint contraction, a biological caution older than reason. It is in the back room, the sealed door, the cloth pushed into the gap at the bottom. Agnes sets the candle on the table and sits on the low stool by the fire and folds her hands in her lap and looks at the flame. She does not look at you. She does not speak. She simply waits, the way a person waits when they have decided that the waiting is finally over. You ask her about the back room. She is quiet for a long moment. Then she says that her husband has been unwell for a long time. She says it in a flat voice, a voice that has told this story before to herself. In the dark, in the hours when the candle burns because the dark presses too close, She says unwell the way a person says a word they have chosen carefully from a much larger and more honest vocabulary. She says he has not left the house in 9 days. You think about the boots beside the door, the chimney cold at the hour when every other hearth in the village was lit, the table cleaned with such thoroughness that no trace remained of what had been arranged upon it before the morning came. You ask if you can see him. Agnes reaches into the pocket of her dress and sets something on the table between you. It is a small bundle of dried herbs, bound with dark thread. Not the forest plants. Something else, something from her kitchen garden, something ordinary and domestic and entirely unthreatening on its own. Set beside the pot she would have filled from the back room, though. Set beside the hemlock smell that lives in this house. Beside a husband who has not been seen in 9 days. It is a different kind of answer than the one you asked for. You cross to the back room door. You pull the cloth from the gap at the bottom. You lift the latch. The smell strikes you first. Fuller now, unfiltered. The green sweet wrongness of it. And then the dark of the room, which is complete. No window, no crack of light, only the shape that the candle behind you slowly illuminates as your eyes adjust. He is in the corner. He is alive. This is the first thing you establish, because you need to establish it, because the stillness of him requires it. He is seated against the far wall with his legs extended and his back straight and his hands open in his lap, and he is breathing. You can see the slow rise and fall of his chest, but he is not awake, or not awake in any way that resembles ordinary sleep. His face is slack and his lips are slightly parted, and his color is the color of old candle wax. On the floor around him, arranged in a careful ring, are the clay pots, 6 of them, all sealed, all identical to the one Clotilde held at a distance between 2 fingers in her dim house this afternoon. And between the pots, pressed into the spaces between them, with the same deliberate attention you saw in the garden bed, are the pale dried stems of the forest plant, face down, all of them, pressed into the gap between the stone floor and the wall as though planted there. As though feeding something. You stand in the doorway and look at the man against the wall and the ring around him, and you understand, slowly, the way you understand things that the mind resists understanding, what you are looking at. This is not murder, or it is not only that. You go back into the main room. Agnes has not moved from the stool. The fire burns between you. You stand across it from her and look at her face in the firelight, and you ask her quietly, as one person asks another, in a room where everything has already been said by the things in it, how long she has been giving it to him. She says, since the summer. You ask what he did. The fire pops. A log shifts. The flame rises briefly and then settles. She looks up at you from the stool, and for the first time today, her face is fully open. Not composed, not smooth, not the careful surface she has held in place through every interaction, through the market and Clotilde's house and the priest's questions and your own standing in her garden in the dark. All of that is gone. What is beneath it is very old and very tired and very certain of itself. She says there was a boy. She says he was 7 years old. She says he came to the edge of the eastern forest in the summer to gather mushrooms, the way children do, and that her husband followed him in, and that the boy did not come back out, and that she knew because she had seen him go, and she had seen her husband go after him, and she had watched the forest from the edge of the garden for the rest of the morning, until her husband came back alone, and went inside without speaking and sat down at the table and said nothing. She says she did not go to the priest. She says she did not go to anyone. She says she went to the forest. No, you think about the soil in the second bed, the disturbed earth, smoothed over with care, the flower heads pressed face down into it, the wrong season for rye. She says she found the boy 3 days later, in the deep shade where the old oaks grow, under a covering of dead leaves and broken branches that someone had arranged with the same thoroughness you apply to something you intend to stay hidden. She says she could not bring him back to the village. She could not carry the truth of what her husband had done into the daylight, where it would have to become a story with names and consequences and a public shape. So she brought him home. She brought him home, and she put him in the ground at the edge of her own garden, in the bed where nothing grows now and nothing will grow. And she marked it in the way she knew how to mark it, with the plants from the forest edge, with the dark thread, with the old words that her grandmother taught her before the church had fully replaced the older way of asking the dead to rest. And then she began to feed her husband the preparation, not to kill him, not quickly, not in any way that would require a grave to be explained or a story to be told, only to keep him still, only to keep him in the half-sleep where he cannot act and cannot speak and cannot leave the house and cannot do what he did to the boy in the forest, only to hold him at the edge of the world until she decides what to do with him. She has not decided yet. A fire burns between you. The candle on the table sends its light up into the low ceiling. The hemlock smell fills the house quietly, thoroughly, the way a presence fills a space when it has been there a long time. You look at the woman on the stool and you think about justice, about what justice means in a place where the priest is the law, and the law is not always equal, and the powerful are protected by the same structures meant to protect the weak. You think about a boy of 7 under the winter earth in a garden bed. You think about what Agnes knew, and what she chose, and the particular kind of courage, and the particular kind of horror that live inside the same choice. She picks up the candle from the table. She says it is late. She says the morning will come early, as it always does. She says this the way she says everything, evenly, quietly, with the composure of a woman who has made her decision and is living inside it, and does not need you to understand it to continue. You go to the door. You step into the lane. Behind you, the door closes, and the latch drops, and the thin line of candlelight at the threshold goes dark. You stand in the cold and the silence of the village at night, and you look up at the sky, and the stars are very clear and very distant, and the eastern forest is a black shape against them, motionless, keeping what it knows. And in the second garden bed, beneath the winter earth, beneath the pale stems pressed face down into the soil, beneath the carefully smoothed surface of a woman's unfinished grief, the boy sleeps. As quietly as everything else in this village that has learned, over a very long time, not to speak. Thank you for listening. New stories every week.